wasn't going to make a video this week. I had a little bit too much on with my day job and a few extra design jobs as well, and covering videos about those Sinnoh remakes, as well as launching a new Kickstarter, link down below. It was all a little bit too much, and I didn't want writing a script to add on to any of that, and I didn't have any new ideas. And then I saw this.
What? Gen Z's trying to what? Cancel Eminem.
And I just... Can we not do this again? This whole intergenerational fight thing where we call the youngest generation useless failures for doing things a little bit too different to the previous generations. Like, millennials, myself included, should remember the time when the entire media was out in force painting everything from the housing market to the fall of Hooters as being the fault of us. And now, since we're not the prime target anymore, we're expected to just jump onto the side of the aggressor and wage war against this younger generation for being different, progressing. Frankly, it's a bit of a bloody joke. So I did a little digging, and well, this isn't really about millennials or Generation Z after all. It's about divide and rule. Because, like, where did this whole thing start? Why did a bunch of millennials just sort of turn against a group that, for all intents and purposes, they should have quite a lot in common with? I mean, both generations are way more progressive, more queer, more online than any previous generation by a country mile. And with the sort of blurry line between generations, since it's not like births happen in neat chunks of time or anything, it makes sense that the generations next to each other should get along. Well, I did some digging, not that I really needed to dig that far because this is an ever-repeating pattern. In about mid-2020, a bunch of newspapers and news sites started publishing articles about the fact that Gen Z hate millennials now. Most notably this one from noted transphobic centrists The Guardian, published in June 2020. But a bunch of news sites from the New York Times to joe.co.uk posted their own editorials or opinion pieces about the follies of Gen Z, pointing out every little flaw that one or two of this massive generation of people might have showcased in a viral TikTok, or in some places, a completely fabricated tweet or blog post. Either that or they ride in from across the battlefield, telling tales of how the other side hates us, telling us all how they hate us for being lazy, complacent liberals, which again is from the anecdotes of one or two TikToks that may or may not actually be real. Either way, these small fringe cases were then taken as the norm and used to forge this massive storyline of two groups that hate each other, and now we're getting clapback and drama articles written by the same handful of clickbait merchants. And well, the idea saturates the general consciousness. It sort of becomes fact. And I can say with confidence that these two groups would not be fighting if the news media had not decided that we are, because it happened before with the Mods and the Rockers. For the uninitiated, the Mods and the Rockers were two counterculture groups in Britain in the 60s and 70s. The interactions between these two are commonly referred to as the Mods versus the Rockers by the general public of the UK, because if you read the papers at the time, which pretty much everyone did, it's not like they had Twitter to get them mad yet, they had to get mad somehow, you'd read about the wars of the Mods and the Rockers having disastrous consequences, about how the wars between these louts and vermin were akin to the Second Battle of Hastings, and that they'd cause violence to surge and flame like a forest fire. But if you asked anyone that was actually in those subcultures at the time, they'd tell you about the small scuffles they got into outside pubs. And they didn't really think that strongly of each other, they were just different subcultures. Sociologist Stanley Cohen verified this in his 1972 study, Folk Devils and Moral Panics, in which he concluded that while, yes, Mods and Rockers had some fights, they were no different to the evening brawls that occurred between youths throughout previous decades. He argued that the UK media had turned the modern rocker subcultures into negative symbols of delinquents and deviant status. They used one-off statistics about hysteria and violence and combined them with any tenuous way to link negative headlines to either subcultures. See this story, where the person fell to their death off a cliff top and it was being linked to a mod invasion, when in actuality it was a completely unrelated incident. Headlines like this were everywhere, and when they ran out of even incidental coincidences to report on, they simply started lying about teen pregnancies and amphetamines being linked, and since they were so ever present, they seeped into the cultural consensus, and thus, Mods and Rockers fight each other became a fact. Now, not only do you have the general public looking down on these two groups of predominantly working class young people, but they successfully convinced some of the people within these subcultures that they do actually hate each other, and more violence actually started after the paper started reporting on it. And hey, this all sounds familiar, right? It's the same moral panic tactic that the news media have been using to start fights between subcultures, and you're seeing the same thing play out in front of you today, not only with Generation Z, but with Black Lives Matter protesters, trans people, basically anyone they decide is the new target, which brings us nicely to our next point. How exactly do they choose their targets, and why do they do this in the first place? And I mean, there are two main answers to both of these questions. It's about power and money. It's very easy to sell a story about a group below you in the hierarchy, since you have access to the printing materials and the presses and the journalists and the stuff to spread all that around, and it's very difficult for them to shout as loud as you can. And if you sensationalize that story a little bit, you sell a little bit more, you get a bit more papers, get a bit more clicks, and well, the dial just got turned further and further up the more powerful people realized it worked. And I mean, now we've got like papers like the Express and the Daily Mail, whose entire presence seems to revolve around spreading bile and vitriol at any minority group or person who happens to exist around them. And the more they persist in telling these exaggerated horror stories and made up bullshit, the more people will believe them and fall into the echo chamber of dehumanizing these groups of people, turning against them, turning against people who might otherwise be their best friends, people who they have so much in common with. Which brings us to our next point. The people in charge of these media companies, people like Paul Dacker, Rupert Murdoch and the like, they're good friends with right-wing politicians. Heck, Boris Johnson began his career writing for rags like The Times and The Spectator, and he's publicly friends with the editors and owners of these and other media companies. In the UK, we call this cronyism, but it's corruption. Let's just call it corruption. Most of the UK news media basically works as a propaganda arm of the government, and the people in charge are very aware that their power, their influence and their profits are inherently connected to a right-wing government staying in power, be it Conservatives or even, at worst, a very milquetoast red Tory like Keir Starmer. So spreading this kind of vitriol does double duty to keep their mates in power. First of all, it means that the audience starts to hate not only the people that you make them hate, be that brown people, trans people or young people, but they also start to hate anyone who speaks for those groups, like for example, left-wing parties and people who support them. So your mate can now stay in power. And then the other reason kind of obfuscates or protects the first reason, and it's something called divide and rule. Basically, it's way easier to stay in control if you keep the people below you fighting each other, because then they're too busy fighting each other to realize it's you they should be fighting. And this is the root of pretty much every single culture war and moral panic in the world. The working class racist and the dad of the migrant family have way more in common than the racist and the newspaper who told him to be racist. The transphobe in the office has way more in common than the trans co-worker that just wants to take a piss than she does with Katie Hopkins. But so long as the people in power are forging these divisions, creating these culture wars, the only thing the bigots will see is deserving targets of their hatred, rather than a fellow victim of late-stage capitalism, creeping fascism, and all the other bullshit we are left to deal with. And with Gen Z being purportedly more queer, more progressive, and more leftist than any previous generation, it's no wonder why they're being turned into the next big punching bag. So let's try our best just not to fall for it, okay? Please?